My dear child, there was a moment spoken in quiet privacy, a moment that was never meant to reach far or become heavy with meaning. And yet somehow, its weight has been moving closer to you with every passing hour, as if it refuses to stay hidden any longer. The person you care about was standing in front of someone they trust deeply. In that space, something subtle shifted in their voice. It softened, slowed down, as though they were careful not to disturb something fragile inside themselves. What they shared about you didn't even begin with your name. It began with a pause, a stillness that already carried feeling before any words arrived. What happened in that conversation was not ordinary, and it changed the atmosphere in the room in a way that could be felt immediately. Even before you were mentioned, emotion had already entered the space. The listener could sense it wasn't a casual exchange anymore. Something deeper was already present. At one point, they looked away. Not because they lacked words, but because too many words were trying to come out at once, and none of them felt easy to say. The question that started it all was simple. Why do you keep thinking about them? For a few seconds, there was nothing, no answer at all. But that silence wasn't empty. It carried more truth than a rushed response ever could. It was the kind of pause that happens when something real is being processed inside the heart before it can become language. When they finally spoke, it was slow and careful, as if every word had already been sitting inside them for a long time. They said they didn't really know how to explain it, but something about you doesn't leave their mind even when life moves on and everything else shifts around them. That wasn't a casual confession. It came from reflection, from private thoughts they had never shared with anyone, and while they spoke, it was clear they were remembering things at the same time, moments, impressions, fragments of you they never expected to hold so tightly. Then came another question: is it serious? Again, silence followed. Not confusion, not avoidance, but something deeper, like they already knew the answer, yet felt it was too large to say simply. And then they admitted that even when they try to push it away, something always brings you back into their thoughts again. That changed everything in the room, because at that point, it was no longer a passing feeling. It had become something that returns on its own, something that doesn't fade just because it is ignored. What surprised the listener most was not even what was said first, but how they described you next. They didn't talk about appearance or situations. They spoke about how your presence feels inside their memory. They said that even in your absence there is a strange sense of calm when they think about you, and that word, calm, meant more than it seemed. Calm is not something people mention lightly. It appears when someone's inner noise has been softened by another person's presence, even if only through memory. It means you reached places in them where tension usually lives. The conversation continued. Another question came. Then why haven't you said anything more? This time the answer came immediately. Because some things feel too meaningful to speak about carelessly. There are emotions that people protect, not because they are weak, but because they matter too much to risk being misunderstood. It wasn't emptiness they were hiding. It was importance they were holding carefully. And then came something unexpected, a line that changed the tone completely. They admitted that sometimes they wonder if you even realize how much you have shifted the way they think. That wasn't said lightly. It was said like something they had been carrying alone for a long time. You may not have noticed the exact moment your presence began to matter this deeply, but for them, it became something that stayed. The listener then asked what they were afraid of. Their voice lowered, almost a whisper. They said that what they feel might already be bigger than what they intended it to be. That sentence revealed more than it tried to hide, because bigger than intended means something that started quietly has grown beyond control or expectation. It means emotion has expanded past the limits they once believed in. At one point, your name was mentioned again, but differently this time, so softly that it changed the atmosphere once more, as if even speaking it carried emotional weight. Then came another question. If they were standing in front of you right now, what would they say? There was silence again, but this one felt different. Not uncertainty, depth. The kind of silence that happens when someone is choosing truth over comfort. Eventually, they answered. They said they would probably tell you that you matter more than you realize. That was the sentence that lingered after everything else faded, the one that didn't leave the room even after the conversation moved on. Because words like that don't end when they are spoken. They continue to echo in places where emotion settles quietly. But the conversation didn't stop there. The listener stayed with the moment and asked something else. When did you first realize this was becoming important to you? That question changed everything again. It opened something they hadn't planned to open. They didn't respond right away. It took time. Their eyes dropped as if they were searching through memory, trying to find a single starting point, but nothing came as just one moment. Instead, they finally said, it wasn't one event. It was many small ones that never left. And that answer carried weight because small moments are often the ones that stay the longest. A voice that replays unexpectedly. A sentence that returns without invitation. A simple detail that appears again in quiet times. When asked what kind of moments, they paused briefly, almost like a hidden smile appeared and disappeared too quickly to be seen clearly. Then they described it. The way you speak without forcing it. The way even simple things feel different when you are part of them. The way certain details about you remain in memory without effort. Everything about their words suggested honesty they hadn't fully admitted before. The listener leaned in slightly and said that they notice more than they pretend to, and for once, there was no resistance. Just quiet acceptance. Yes, probably more than I should, they replied. And that admission said everything, because people only speak like that when something inside them has already gone beyond control in subtle ways. When thought becomes feeling, and feeling becomes something that returns on its own, without permission. And even now, what was shared in that conversation continues to echo quietly, like something that was never meant to be loud, but was never meant to disappear either. Then something shifted in the room in a way even the listener didn't expect. Your name came up again, but this time, it wasn't hesitant or carefully measured. It was spoken with a quiet warmth that couldn't be disguised. Nothing dramatic, nothing exaggerated. Just something real slipping through without permission. And right after saying your name, they added a line that changed the entire meaning of everything that had been said before it. They have no idea how often they cross my mind. That sentence didn't need explanation. It landed on its own weight. Because how often someone appears in your thoughts says more than any carefully chosen words ever could. Repetition is rarely random. When a person keeps returning in the mind, it usually means something about them is still alive inside, still active, still unresolved in some quiet way. The listener noticed that immediately and asked gently, "Then why keep it inside?" The answer came without delay, as if it had already been waiting. Because when something matters too much, you become careful with it. That wasn't fear. It was value. There are things people don't speak loudly about, not because they are uncertain, but because they don't want them to be reduced, misunderstood, or treated lightly. Care replaces noise when something is meaningful enough to protect. And still, the strongest part of the conversation hadn't arrived yet. The listener leaned in and asked one final question that changed the direction completely. What would surprise them most if they heard you now? For the first time, there was no searching pause, no hesitation. The answer came clean and direct. That I speak about them here with more honesty than I ever have anywhere else. That admission changed the atmosphere instantly. Because there is a difference between performing emotion and quietly revealing it. And in that moment, there was no performance left, only what had been held back for too long. Then came something even more unexpected. Sometimes I hear something completely ordinary during the day, and it reminds me of them immediately. The room went still after that, because ordinary things, random sounds, words, places, even passing moments, don't usually carry emotional weight unless someone has become deeply associated with them. When that happens, memory stops being controlled. It starts appearing on its own, The listener went quiet for a moment before asking softly, "Do you think they would believe this?" A small pause followed. "Probably not, because I never show how much stays in my mind." And that line explained more than anything else. Not everything that is felt is visible. Some emotions stay hidden, not because they are absent, but because they are still being processed internally by the one carrying them. Before the conversation ended, one final thought escaped without warning. If they ever knew everything I've said here, they would understand why forgetting them was never easy. And after that, no one rushed to fill the silence, because some statements are too complete to interrupt. They don't need response, they simply remain. But the conversation didn't actually end there. Even after it should have been over, something lingered. The person you care about stayed for a moment longer, as if their thoughts hadn't fully followed their actions yet. The listener noticed, but said nothing. Sometimes silence allows what is hidden to surface on its own. And it did. "There's something strange," they finally said. "Even when I decide not to think about them, they still come back. No build-up, no filtering, just truth arriving as it is." The listener slowly turned toward them, now fully aware that this was no longer casual conversation. This was something deeper, breaking through restraint. Then another layer followed. It happens at random times, in the middle of ordinary things, and somehow it feels stronger every time. That detail mattered, because random thoughts usually fade. But when something returns with increasing intensity, it often means it is anchored somewhere deeper than surface memory. The listener asked carefully, "What returns first? The memory, the feeling, or the question?" A brief pause. The feeling. That one word changed everything, because memory can be triggered by coincidence, but feeling doesn't return unless something inside still recognizes emotional significance. Feelings don't reappear without connection. They resurface when something remains unfinished beneath awareness. They didn't say your name right away this time. Instead, they looked down slightly, almost as if they were recognizing something within themselves. It's hard to explain, but some people stay in your mind in a way that doesn't ask permission. That line lingered heavily in the air, because it describes something beyond control, something that doesn't wait to be invited or forgotten. It simply stays. The listener continued, "So what happens when their name appears?" The answer came quietly, but clearly. Everything else becomes less important for a moment. And that was more revealing than it sounded. Because when attention shifts like that, even briefly, it shows where emotional weight naturally goes without effort or decision. Then came another confession, softer than before. "I noticed details I never thought I would care about." "What kind of details?" the listener asked. A breath, then honesty. The way they speak, certain words they use, even small things nobody else would notice. And in that final admission, everything that had been unfolding became clear, not as something dramatic or sudden, but as something slowly forming over time, through attention that never fully left. Attention always reveals value. People rarely notice small things unless those small things quietly start to matter in a deeper way. The listener leaned in slightly and said softly, "You sound like someone who has already thought about this far too much." And for the first time, there was no denial. "Maybe I have, more than anyone realizes." That simple admission changed the entire atmosphere, because when someone stops defending their thoughts and instead acknowledges them, it usually means those thoughts have already been living inside them for a long time. What is spoken publicly is often limited. What is carried privately tends to be far more complex. Then, almost like a thought slipping out before it could be controlled, they added, "Sometimes I wonder if they can feel any of this without me ever saying it." That question revealed something important. People don't wonder about unspoken connection unless the feeling has become consistent enough to feel real in daily life. At that point, It stops being curiosity and starts becoming awareness. The listener paused, then asked one final question before the moment shifted. If they were standing here right now, what would be the hardest thing for you to admit? There was a longer silence this time, not empty but full of thought, like something inside was being carefully sorted before it could become words. Then the answer came, that I've been acting normal while carrying far more than I ever planned to. And that sentence quietly explained everything, because acting normal usually means something has already changed internally, and more than planned suggests the feeling didn't stay within limits, it grew beyond what they expected or intended. Before the conversation could fully settle, something else happened. After the person you care about walked away, the moment should have ended there. But it didn't. They slowed down a few steps later and stopped, not because anyone called them, not because something interrupted them, but because their own thoughts had become louder than the world around them. They stood still for a moment, looking at nothing in particular, almost as if replaying everything they had just said. And then, very quietly, almost under their breath, they repeated your name. That small moment mattered more than anything else before it, because a name is only repeated in silence when it still carries emotional weight, even after the conversation has ended. The listener, still nearby, noticed and asked, "Why do you always go quiet after talking about them?" The answer came without hesitation this time, because every time I speak honestly about them, I realize how much I usually don't say. And suddenly, everything shifted again. Because this meant what had been spoken so far was not the full truth, only the part that managed to surface. The listener stayed focused and asked carefully, "Then what stays unsaid?" A pause followed, this time thoughtful rather than empty. Then they said, "On most days, I try to focus on other things, but even then, something small always brings them back before the day ends." That line carried weight because unnoticed returns of thought are rarely random. When someone appears in the mind during ordinary moments, it usually means they've become part of the mind's rhythm, not just memory. The listener continued, "What kind of small things?" The answer came quickly, as if already familiar. A phrase, a sound, a place, or even something ordinary that suddenly feels connected to them. And that's where something subtle became clear. Connection doesn't form through force or effort, it forms quietly through repetition, familiarity, and emotional imprint. Then, unexpectedly, there was a brief smile they couldn't fully hide. The listener noticed and asked, "Why are you smiling?" And the answer came gently, "Because some memories arrive before I even think about calling them." That line lingered. Because when memories appear on their own, it usually means the person is no longer just remembered, they are integrated into how the mind naturally responds. The listener then said softly, "You speak as if they changed something in you." After a breath, the answer came, "They did, even if they never fully realized it." That confession carried more honesty than anything before it, because people only admit being changed when the effect has already settled inside them for a long time. Then came another thought, quieter this time. Sometimes I wonder if they understand how naturally my thoughts return to them. Not forced, not dramatic, just natural return. And that distinction mattered, because what returns naturally often belongs deeper than what is intentionally remembered. The listener asked one final question before the moment ended. If they heard everything you said today, what would surprise them the most? The answer came without delay. That I speak carefully on the outside, but inside, my thoughts are much louder than I ever show. And in that moment, everything that had been hidden became clear in a simple contrast, quiet outside, louder within. It wasn't just a sentence anymore. It felt like a small door opening, revealing a space that had always been there but rarely seen. The kind of space people carry every day without naming it. Because people who feel deeply don't always speak more. Often, they speak less. not because there is less inside them, but because what's inside takes more space than words can easily carry. There are thoughts that arrive too fast to organize, emotions that overlap each other, and meanings that don't fit neatly into speech. So they stay inside, fully alive, even when the outside looks calm. You might look at someone like that and assume they are simple or even quiet in a plain way. But silence is not emptiness. Sometimes silence is pressure. Sometimes it is fullness. Sometimes it is a whole world happening at once, just not translated into sound. Inside them, conversations don't stop. One thought interrupts another. A memory appears in the middle of a present moment. A feeling arrives without permission and stays longer than expected. And yet, on the outside, they still manage to smile at the right time, nod when needed, respond in a way that feels balanced. Not because they are hiding who they are, but because they are filtering what can actually be shared. And that filtering takes effort, more effort than people realize. Before everything ended, they added one final line, soft, almost fading into the air. What matters most is often revealed in what we never say out loud. And that stayed behind after everything else. Because some truths don't need to be spoken loudly to remain unforgettable. In fact, the quieter they are, the longer they stay. Words spoken out loud can be answered, argued with, or forgotten, but the things left unsaid have a different kind of weight. They don't leave through conversation. They stay in perception, in feeling, in the way someone replays a moment long after it has passed. There is something about unspoken truth that lingers differently. It doesn't demand attention. It simply exists, waiting to be understood when the mind is quiet enough to notice it. And maybe that is why some people remember not what was said in a conversation, but what was felt between the words. The pause before a reply, the hesitation in a voice, the way someone looked away for half a second too long. Those are the places where the real story often lives, because expression is not only in speech, it is also in timing, in silence, in what is chosen not to be expanded into language. The person speaking was not trying to sound mysterious. They were simply describing something that had always been true for them. That their inner world was not smaller than others, it was just less visible. And visibility is not the same as depth. Inside, there is often a constant awareness. Not loud like noise, but layered like waves. One feeling touches another. One thought leads to 5 more questions. Even simple moments are processed in more directions than they appear. A conversation might look like a few sentences on the surface, but underneath, it becomes a whole chain of reflections. And still, most of that remains unspoken, not because it is secret, but because language is limited. It can only carry so much at once before meaning starts to flatten. So instead, people like this learn another way of expressing themselves, through presence, through tone, through what they choose to respond to and what they choose to leave untouched, through how long they hold eye contact, or how quickly they look away, through small pauses that carry more honesty than full explanations. And over time, they begin to understand something important. Not everything internal is meant to be externalized. Some thoughts are meant to be lived, not spoken. Some feelings are meant to be understood privately before they are ever shared. The silence they carry is not absence. It is compression. A condensed version of everything they feel, waiting for the right moment or the right person to unfold. That is why when they said, "I speak carefully on the outside, but inside my thoughts are much louder than I ever show," it wasn't just a description, it was an explanation of how they exist in the world, balanced between what is expressed and what remains internal. And in that balance, something very human becomes visible. Because everyone, in some way, has an inner world that is larger than what they show. The difference is only in how much of it is translated into speech. Some people translate freely, some translate carefully, and some keep most of it as feeling, never fully turning it into words, but all of it still exists. And when the moment ended, what remained was not the conversation itself, but the awareness it left behind. a quiet understanding that silence is not empty and that what is not said can sometimes shape a connection more deeply than what is. Because in the end, what matters most is often not in what is spoken directly, but in what continues to echo after everything has already been said and done.